Hello and good morning friends, welcome to the CEC-UGC live lecture. Dear friends, as you know that we have started a new series and this series is on history of English literature. In our previous session yesterday we talked about the Anglo-Saxon period. Today we would be specifically talking on the Anglo Norman period, and I would say that in the first session we would be discussing on the rise of Middle English, whereas in the second session we would be discussing on the Anglo Norman literature. And for this discussion we have once again with us in our studios Professor Bhimsen Dahiya. Professor Dahiya is a renowned academician, as well as I would like to tell you all that he has written various books on Anglo-American literature, as well as various books for the students of higher education. So dear friends, I believe that Professor Dahiya is the appropriate person to talk on the history of English literature. So without wasting any time, I would like to welcome our guest, Professor Bhimsen Dahiya. Hello sir, welcome to the EduSet lecture.
Thank you. Well, yesterday we covered the first phase of English language and literature called the Anglo-Saxon period, and the English of that period was called Old English, because before that English was actually not there. It was struggling to come up, but it was being dominated by the ruler's language, which was French. Earlier it was Latin. So common people, of course, used to speak English. It was the language of the subjects, of the populace, people who were ruled. But the elite class, the ruling class, and the rich people, they spoke the official language. So during this period also, Anglo-Norman period, which is also called the period of Middle English, that struggle continued between French, which was the language of the elite, language of the rulers, language of the upper strata of society, and English, which was spoken by the general public, the lower strata, and therefore the popular idiom of the people. So this struggle continued because ultimately these were the times when people were rising. They were becoming self-conscious of their importance, of their power, because now the medieval times were coming to an end. And during medieval times we had monarchies, we had kings, princes, they were ruling the people. But now people were rising and they were realizing their power, and therefore their language was also becoming assertive, and English was becoming assertive in comparison to French. Of course, during this period, which means 1066 to 1400, which will be the end of the medieval period. So this is second phase of the medieval period. We are heading towards the Renaissance, towards the modern period. Now 1066 is known for the invasion of the Normans. So Normans came from the Scandinavian countries. They were French speaking. They invaded England, and obviously whoever rules imposes their own language. So they imposed French. French became the language of the elite, of the rulers, and people supporting the rulers and becoming rich and so on. But common people continue to speak the local dialect, so to say, and that is called Middle English during this period. But this struggle ultimately has to go in favor of the popular language of the people. In some time in 1400, middle of the 14th century, English overpowered French. It, you see, asserted itself, and it became the official language of the rulers also. Before the middle of 14th century, this has no status because it was the language of the subjects, people who were ruled, people who were not ruling. Now this language asserted itself and people asserted themselves. Therefore, it became the official language of England in the middle of the 14th century. The new status, and of course people now took pride in having their own language as the official language. And obviously, as Michael Foucault, the French linguist and philosopher, he has said, power and knowledge are intimately related, and it is the patronage of power, patronage of the rulers, which grows a language, which develops a language. So now in the middle of the 14th century, English came to have that patronage of the rulers, and therefore it developed into a sophisticated language. Of course, it had to absorb a good deal from the French, because French was already a developed language, much ahead of English. Therefore, it had to absorb those qualities of the French language. Just as the lower classes, the middle classes, they keep absorbing many things of cultural life from the dominant upper classes, the elite. So what is true of culture is true of language also. Language also is a part of culture. And therefore, English as a language of the populace, of the common people, now since it was aspiring to become the ruling language, it had to absorb certain qualities to make the grade. And those qualities it absorbed from French. For example, the refinement, the sophistication, because common people do not know sophistication. They do not have refinement. So they will not say things in a very refined manner. They will straightway, just like hitting the nail, they will say things what they want to say. So straight talk and blunt talk, that is what the common people would do. So English now becoming the official language, becoming also the language of the rulers, had to acquire these qualities from the French. So one of them was its refinement of language, refinement of expression, refinement of style. So all that came from the French, and it absorbed those qualities so that it could compete with French. And very soon, of course, it started competing. Otherwise, earlier it was looked down upon by the ruling classes. Now, the best example of its coming of age, its acquiring refinement and sophistication, is the poetry of Chaucer. Geoffrey Chaucer, he was the greatest poet and the last poet of the medieval period. Born in 1340, died in 1400, right at the end of the medieval period. So during this period, which means later half of the 14th century, he was writing poetry in English. And it was during this very period, as I said, the middle of the 14th century, that English occupied the pride of place and forced itself as the official language. So Chaucer had that advantage. He comes at a time when his own language has attained this new status and has acquired certain qualities from the French. So one of them was refinement, sophistication, both of idiom, which means vocabulary, as well as of expression, which means style. And not only that, content also. The forms of poetry as well as prose at that time, which were monopolized by the French, were the romances, for example. So the romance stories written in poetry are told like a tale, a story. They were confined to the upper classes. It was meant for them. They used to enjoy that literature. For example, the Knights at Arms, King Arthur and the knights of his court. Those stories, even later, you see Spencer doing that in the Fairy Queen, with every book having a new warrior, a knight. So the adventures of the knights, like rescuing a lady, offering love to a lady, and killing those who are harassing the lady, these incidents were very common. And they became the narratives, contents of these tales in verse or stories in poetry. So it was this kind of thing that happened during the later part of the 14th century. And that's why the series of poems that Chaucer wrote, we'll be talking about them later, the Canterbury Tales. So the Canterbury Tales are a series of tales in verse, in poetry form. But then, just like the novel, different sections of society, they get their representation in these tales. So all tales put together, they constitute a sort of cultural history of the people of the time. So Chaucer can be called the cultural historian of the 14th century. And 14th century England is pictured, is transcribed, is brought alive in the Canterbury Tales. He devises a very interesting way of telling these tales. Those days, just as we have today, they used to go to the shrines, like we go to the shrine of Mata Vaishno Devi. So a group of people going to the shrine. So they had this shrine at Kent. That is why Canterbury Tales, because going to Kent to do this homage to the goddess. And here is a group of people. So obviously it is very natural when you are going on foot and it will take days and months to complete your journey, going there and coming back. So you will feel bored. You should be doing something. You can't just be walking all the time. So they said, all right, everyone will tell 4 stories, 2 while going and 2 while returning. So there were 30, including the poet Chaucer. There were 29 others. So he said, all right, I will also join and I will also give 4 stories. So 30 into 4, it became a sequence of 140, I say, tales in verse. So that is what Chaucer does in the Canterbury Tales. And that is how this Middle English evolved itself. After all, how does a language evolve? The first condition is that it must get patronage of the ruling class, of the elite. Second is that it must be made official language so that everybody speaks it and contributes to it. Third is that it should be made the medium of instruction. If the entire education is being imparted through a language, that language of course will develop, because so many people will be writing poetry, prose, drama, fiction, verses, so on and so forth. So all this came about into English in the 14th century, later half we are talking about. So this period from 1066 to 1400 is called, as I said, the Anglo Norman Period. Why Anglo Norman? Because Normans had invaded England in 1066 and had become the ruling class. Obviously, then it was their language which was imposed officially for all official purposes, for educational purposes. So it acquired the pride of place. It became the dominant language. And obviously, when a language gets an opportunity to do all this, it is bound to develop, because it is through opportunities that you develop even the individual personality or the personality of a nation, the culture of a people. All these will develop only when opportunities are given. When something is done, it is sponsored by the powers that be, because ultimately to do anything you need money also, and you need compulsory involvement of the people. So this can be done only by the rulers. They can provide you funds. They can make it officially compulsory for schools and colleges, universities, and also in the offices. So that is what the Normans did. They made the French language compulsory in all these departments of life. But then simultaneously, side by side, the language of the people, which was English, this Middle English, this also benefited. Benefited because, after all, both languages were to be spoken in the same country, and people who were living together. So it was natural that they will be influencing each other, and a sort of assimilation, integration reconciliation of the two rival languages had to take place. And also, ultimately, it is the language of the people which has to win the battle, And that is why English stayed in the middle of the 14th century, because it asserted itself that why should the nation continue with a foreign language? Like there are reactions and there are calls in our own country against English. Why must we continue with the language of our erstwhile rulers? But then language, literature are, you see, areas of our life which cannot be strictly tied to politics. Ultimately, their effects, their functionings go beyond the political arena, and they have larger influence over the people as such, where politics would not matter. So the same thing happened, that to begin with, no doubt, French was the language of the ruling classes. But ultimately, if it had to survive, it had to make peace with the language of the people. And language of the people was English. So one way of making peace was to reconcile their areas of rivalry, that you try to make this rivalry less stiff and less pointed, less sharp. So once that is realized, then languages start borrowing from each other. And that is precisely what happened between English and French, that they started absorbing influences from each other. For example, before the French language, in English there were no meters. Poetry was not measured in terms of feet, you know that. You have tetrameter, we have pentameter, we have hexameter. All these meters, they measure your lines into feet. Two syllables, one stressed and the other unstressed, the two will make 1 foot. So if you have 5 such feet in a line, then it is called pentameter. So most of the English blank verse, particularly Shakespearean drama and other dramatic verses, they are written in pentameter. Chaucer's poetry also is generally in the pentameter. So this influence came from the French, because in English the verse was merely alliterative. Alliterative verse is where there is rhythm but no meter. It is not 4 feet or 5 feet or 6 feet, hexameter or tetrameter or pentameter. It is just the rhythm of sounds, rise and fall, rise and fall, rise and fall. You have that alliterative movement of verse where you have some sort of music coming out of it, coming out of its space. But at the same time, it is not strictly measured by the meter, by the feet, as the French poetry was. So this was one of the strong influences which came from the French language and French poetry into English verse, which became from alliterative to metrical verse under the influence of the French. That is how this Anglo Norman period developed the English language, largely under the influence of the French, which was the language of the Normans, the ruling class. Okay. Well, in the first lecture we covered the Anglo Norman period with regard to the development of the language. Now we will be dealing with the development of literature during that period. After all, language is all right for its own sake, so long as it remains confined to communication among people and so on. But then that is not the end of the use of language. The real and the ultimate use of a language comes in the literature which is written in that language. After all, that is the flowering. If English is read all over the world today, it is because it has great literature in it. Shakespeare, for example, is translated in all the languages of the world. Shakespeare is read all over the world, in English, direct also, because most people would learn English only to read these authors. So similarly, during the Anglo Norman period, it was not English but French which had that pride of place. But gradually, as I said, English was asserting itself, and finally when we reach the end of the century, 1400, the position is totally reversed. It is English which takes over, and French is subdued, absorbed and kicked out. That is the position. So after Chaucer and after the end of the 14th century, English becomes the official language of the people, of the government, of literature, everywhere. So it occupied that position. So Anglo Norman literature also came up. Obviously, language will not remain just for communication. After all, some people have creative talent. They would like to write poetry, they would like to write short stories, they would like to write romances. So, whatever talent you have, the urge is, the compulsion from within is to express yourself. The very word, if you given attention to it, express, means there is something pressing inside which requires to come out. That is why the word expression. So every language then is used for expression, because people have emotions, people have sentiments, people have feelings, people have ideas, people have thoughts, people have philosophies. So all these things would require language for their expression. Without language, it will not be possible. So during this period also, different forms of literature came up. One of them was this short tale in verse, written in poetry, but a story told. Later on, of course, this became the privilege of prose and prose fiction, short stories as well as then later longer fiction, novels. But during this period, Chaucer and around that time, even stories, tales, they were written in verse, in poetry. That is why I gave the example of Chaucer himself. He wrote those Canterbury Tales, 120 tales in poetry. So that was one form. Another form of literature that came up during this period was romance. Romance was a longer story. Romance was focused on adventures of the high-ups, means the elite class, the ruling class, and obviously they will have love affairs also, for example, in style. Common man would not know style, because style, sophistication, they come with your riches. If you are rich enough, then you will do things in style, but common people will straightway do what they want to do, because they don't have means to adopt styles. So romance is sort of the same story told in a style. So those short stories, short tales in verse, they acquired higher status in romance. And in romance, of course, you cannot have common people as heroes. So there has to be a prince or a warrior. And now these warriors using sword, conquering battles, and romances focused on the man-woman relationship. And these warriors showed their heroic talents in rescuing ladies in distress. For example, if there is a bad character or a monster or a dragon or somebody with ill will are trying to injure the prestige and dishonor a woman. So these knights at arms, they will come to her rescue and save her. And there lied their heroism. So it were these stories, this kind of stories that came up in what are called the romances. So besides the shorter tales, just like the Canterbury, came up these romances and confined, as I said, to the upper classes, because it is not for the common man to have romance. He can't afford to do that. He has no means to do that. Like King Arthur and Knights of his court. So several romances were written about them, about their adventures. It were this kind of stories that were called romances. So short stories, then romances, and then there were histories, chronicles. They were called rhymed chronicles, so that they could be sung. Even here, if you remember, histories are sung by professionals. So there also, history of England, it was chronicled. So they were called chronicles. And they were rhymed chronicles so that they could be sung. And two writers made in special great name in doing this. One of them was Robert of Gloucester. Gloucester. So Gloucester is one of the important places, cities, and they have their sort of little kingdoms there. If you remember King Lear, in King Lear also, besides Lear, there is Gloucester, the second family. And Gloucester also has his own setup as a sort of subsidiary ruler under King Lear. Similarly, here we had Robert of Gloucester. He was one of those who wrote rhymed chronicles. Another was Robert Manning of Brunei. Robert Manning, Manning of Brunei, Brunne. So he also made a name for his rhymed Story of England. That was the title of his book, Story of England, but written in rhymed verse. Just as Robert Gloucester's rhymed chronicles, here we had rhymed Story of England. He also wrote Handling Sin. Now the spellings are very different. Look at it. The modern spelling of handling will be Handling. But during that period, Middle English, the spellings were Handlying, handling, and sin also not sin, but Synne. That was the spelling of sin. So he wrote this other book also in verse, in rhymed verse, called Handling Sin. From the titles you can see that the subject, the content of these compositions were either historical or divine. Divine means related to religious matters, related to religious values, to promote them, to propagate them. Another type of poetry, now we are coming to the third one, was religious and didactic. An important example being Ormulum, Ormulum. This was one of the titles of a divine book, a religious book, and called Ormulum because it was written by a writer with that name, ORM, Orm. So Orm was the writer. His book came to be known as Ormulum, Ormulum. So this is dated 1200. You can see that it's right in the beginning, because we are dealing with the period 1066 to 1400. So this comes in 1200. Still better known than this is the didactic poem called The Owl and the Nightingale. The Owl and the Nightingale. So it is just like our animal stories. You remember Panchtantra? So one of the oldest books we have, and in Panchtantra you have animal stories. But actually they are meant to educate the prince. The prince is being taught administration and so on, how to rule people. Similarly, here the same thing is being done through these books, the divine teaching of the Bible, and then of course administration. So one of these didactic poems was The Owl and the Nightingale. But in this case, the author is not known. There, Ormulum, we know the author is Orm. But here in this case, the author is not known. So it remains anonymous even today, unknown authorship, The Owl and the Nightingale. But very popular tale it became. And still another was Curson Mundi, a strange name, Cursonemundi, Curson Mundi, covering all the Bible stories. So that, in a way rehashes the stories from the Bible, Old Testament. And these stories, time and again, they were written, rewritten, revised, improved, modernized by so many writers. So during this period of Middle English, Anglo Norman, again the Bible stories were rewritten, and all written in metrical poetry. The non-metrical alliterative verse in Midland dialect also continued, and there was poetry in alliterative verse also. The Midland dialect means common people will still continue speaking the dialect. Sophistication comes for the elite class. They keep refining the language. They keep producing literature which again is sophisticated. Common people can't even appreciate because there is form, there is style. So unless you are conversant with the literary forms, what are they? And literary styles, you cannot appreciate them. So in a way, you have to be a sort of technician of literature, technician of poetry. So for the common people then, they have literature produced in Midland dialect. One of the most famous poem which is read even today is Pearl in this Midland dialect, Pearl, Pearl. Another is Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Sir Gawain, Gawain, and the Green Knight, Knight. So there were romances also besides these, and romances included King Horn. This was one of the popular romances of the period, King Horn. Another was the Lay of Havelock the Dane, Havelock, Havelock the Dane, Dane. The best, of course, was Maud Arthur, which is read even today, which is prescribed for study at the higher level, those doing MA, PhD, and so on. They read this poem, Maud Arthur. This is about the exploits, the heroics of King Arthur. You remember King Arthur and his court. So right from Celtic days, the earliest language of the English people, stories have been written about King Arthur. So here again in the Midland dialect and romance, we had Maud Arthur. Then there were short lyrics also, like sonnets, like just lyrics, not necessarily sonnets, but just musical poems. And these were influenced by both French and Latin languages. After all, you can't be just original. Languages influence each other, and the more developed a language, more influential it will be. Just as people who are well off in your neighborhood, they become the model and they influence the lives of others because everybody wants to imitate them, dress up like them, speak like them, live like them, have a car, so on and so forth. So similarly here, there were such models and they were being imitated. Now there were religious writings also, just poems, for example, poetry addressed to Virgin Mary, Mother of Christ. You know that Christ is said to be born of Virgin Mary without marriage. We also have such stories. Who was without marriage born? Are you not watching Mahabharata these days? Karan. Karan was also born that way. Anyway, so you have also a poem called Cuckoo Song, very popular, and just a lyric. So these are some of the poems of the time which made a mark and which continue to be read even today. Now, the period, Anglo Norman, was not producing just poetic literature. After all, some people would write prose also. Prose, of course, took time to come of age. So poetry was the first choice. And in the early phases of civilization, of the growth of culture, it was poetry which remained the medium of expression for all sorts of writings. It may be official, it may be literary, it may be entertainment, whatever. But then gradually prose followed. After all, everybody cannot appreciate poetry. Some people will need entertainment or instruction or education through prose. So even though belated, prose developed during this period. This was for example, it's a strange name, ANCRENE, Encrene, rival, REIVLE, very strange spellings. But then it is a sort of early version of King James's Bible. King James's Bible, came about in the early 17th century, because King James comes after Queen Elizabeth. So Queen Elizabeth was between 1558 and 1603, a very long period for the Queen to rule England. The best period also. By the way, Guru Granth Sahib, it was also written about the same time when King James's Bible was written. So King James's Bible, in a way, was foreseen in this Encrene rival. It was an early version of King James's Bible. So an epitome of standard English prose also. Of course, King James's Bible is known not merely for its biblical content, but also known for its prose style. One of the greatest writers of the 20th century, American, Ernest Hemingway, he said, I learned my style from King James's Bible. Means by reading these stories, by imitating the sentences there, I learned to write my prose, and he became the best prose writer of the 20th century. So King James's Bible has had that very long influence on English literature. And English literature not merely confined to England, but even in America and elsewhere. So with this came, with this development of prose, logicality and clarity as its chief virtues. Obviously, poetry, you cannot say, is dominated by these qualities of rationality and logicality, because poetry is dominated more by sentiments, by emotions, by feelings, and these things by nature are not logical, they are not rational. So prose will have different subjects. So you have reasoning there, you have logic there. That is why all law books, all social science books and so on, they are all written in prose, because you can have logicality, rationality, argument, developing a theme in prose. You cannot have that in poetry. Hence, you have these virtues in the prose writings of the Anglo Norman period. That is why even today King James's Bible does not sound dated, and the other prose also of the period, it does not sound old. Even today it sounds as fresh as if written in the 20th or 21st century. So that is how the story of the Anglo Norman literature goes. Produced in the Anglo Norman language called the Middle English, and the variety of literature in poetry and prose was produced, beginning with tales, then romances, then short stories, adventure, divine poems, so on and so forth. Similarly, in prose, you had divine themes as well as themes of adventures, and of course themes of instructions. So that is how I would complete and wind up this discussion about Anglo Norman literature.
With this notes, thank you, sir. Thank you so very much for giving us a deep insight into the Anglo-Norman period, and I hope that all the students who might have watched us or would be watching us with the help of YouTube would be getting benefited from this lecture. Dear friends, we would like to tell you all that if you want to give your feedback or if you have any queries or questions, then you can mail us at info.cc@nic.in. Very soon we are going to upload this lecture on YouTube for you, so that it becomes easier for you to access the lectures number of times you wanted, as well as the earlier lecture on the Anglo-Saxon period is also there for you on the YouTube. So we would be meeting again tomorrow, and tomorrow we would be talking on the age of Chaucer. We would be discussing on Chaucer's Canterbury Tales as well as the Scottish Chaucerians. So dear friends, I would like to tell you all again that if you want to have a session on a particular topic, then also you can mail us at info.cc@nic.in. We would be meeting again tomorrow. Till then, take care. Goodbye. Thank you, sir. Thank you so very much.
Thank you very much.